Okay, great. Welcome back. So we will be continuing on talking about the barbarians, and we will also be analyzing together the text from Tacitus. So Rome encounters the noble savages. So make sure that you have a copy of this in front of you or print it out. Okay, so I'm going to start by recapping what we talked about last time, and then we'll move on and actually closely analyze the text from Tacitus, and then we'll wrap up actually the semester and look for some give an overview and recap of the reasons for Rome's decline. Okay, so to review from last time, what and who was a barbarian? So as we said, the Romans used barbarian as a pejorative term that was applied to others. Barbarian meant non-Roman. Someone who came from outside the Roman Empire. Someone who, A, did not speak Latin, and someone who was not civilized. However, by this definition, ironically, not all barbarians were barbarian. Technically, not all of the invading tribes were actually Germanic. Some of them were the relatives of the modern French, the Spanish. So it's actually preferable for us today to use this seemingly politically incorrect term barbarians, right? Because technically, to say Germanic tribes, not all of these invading peoples were technically Germanic. So even though barbarian was a derogatory term for the Romans, as we said last time, believed that barbarians could always become civilized. Barbarian was not a ethnic or racial term for a racist in the 19th century. Someone of a supposedly inferior race could not change their ethnicity or skin color. But to Romans, ethnicity, skin color, or physical characteristics wasn't so important. Romans would say that the barbarians could change and become civilized, so indeed barbarians could become Roman citizens. So therefore, barbarians were never perceived of as a different species or race, but this is very important. A barbarian was a man or woman at an inferior state of human development, a person at a sort of inferior stage of development, a being who is defective, unfinished, incomplete, uncivilized. Okay? So the barbarian, just as the civilized Roman who has Romanitas, is subject to change and always can evolve and always can strive to be higher. So access to Roman humanitas was always possible, but it was always possible to fall back into barbarism, to not act in a civilized way. However, of course, the crisis of the 3rd century changed this definition. The crisis of the 3rd century not only doubled the size of the army and taxes, but produced definite changes of attitudes towards barbarians. As Roman citizens became aware of the fragility of their once mighty and vast empire, they espoused new attitudes towards barbarians. So now that the empire was on the defensive, definitions of Roman and barbarian hardened and crystallized, and now that the empire was on the decline, no one expected expansion, and the barbarians shifted from being people who one day would be incorporated into the empire and become civilized to people who were viewed as hostile. So this idea that the barbarian could have become Romanized, become civilized, acquiring Romanitas, Romanness, was sharpened by the crisis of the 3rd century and became now impossible. So we said that barbarians were distinguished by the Romans as a social, cultural, and economic category, not as an ethnic group necessarily. Barbarians did not practice agriculture or long-distance trade. They did not live in cities. They were nomadic. They moved around. They were thought to be a-religious because they didn't worshipped the Roman gods. They worshipped outdoors in shrines and worshipped female earth gods, which was quite different than the Roman religion. And they were often thought to be lazy because they spent their time hunting and weren't productive in the way that the Romans thought civilized people should be. They didn't have private ownership of land. They did not have a zeal for agriculture. They ate a lot of meat and milk and cheese, which the Romans thought was unhealthy. It was a bad balance for the constitution. Of course, they looked different. They wore pants and animal furs. They wore heavy, bulky clothing, not the loose draped togas, and they drank beer and ate meat. Now, a classic source that we have for learning about Roman attitudes towards barbarians is that of Tacitus. So Tacitus was a Roman historian and ethnographer, and as your text says here, it's important to note he's writing at the peak of the Roman Empire. His book, this is from a book called Germania. Germania is really the only surviving ethnographic treatise concerned with the northern barbarian. So he's writing about the Germanic tribes on the Rhine and Danube frontier. This is really the only surviving treatise from this time of the 1st century AD, and therefore it's very important. Now, I would say also that its modern influence has been very great, partly because it painted a picture of the German noble savage that modern German nationalists could accept in the 19th and 20th century. And as we said before, the noble savage, this is the idea that even though the Germanic tribes are supposedly uncivilized, right, that there was a great deal about them that was good, precisely because they were uncivilized, precisely because they were not as corrupt and as decadent as the Romans. Okay, so you see this idea here in the introduction. In his study of Roman politics, he described abundant examples of corruption and tyranny, but among the Germanic tribes, he found a good deal to admire. Okay. Now, I would say that Tacitus' ideas are taken up by German nationalists in the 19th century. As well, it had obvious appeal to the National Socialists. He wrote that the inhabitants of Germania were not tainted by intermarriage with other tribes, and they were a distinct and pure people. This is something that appealed to the National Socialist program of racial hygiene. So this had obvious appeal to people in the Hitler era obsessed with racial purity. Of course, Tacitus never intended that his work would be read in such a way. So how did Tacitus define a German? Well, he did not use the criteria of language, but used, as was typical of Rome at the time, social, economic, geographic, and moral criteria. So we can see that in Roman ideas of who was a barbarian at this time, at the height of the empire, there was sort of a scale of barbarianism. Some barbarians were perceived to be less barbarian than others, depending on how advanced their culture was. So again, we see in Tacitus's work the idea of the noble savage and how he both praises and censors, criticizes, the Germans. He mentions that the Germans do not value silver and gold. They do not dress ostentatiously. They were very strict monogamists. Adultery was very rare. Their children were not pampered. They were generous, hospitable, and there was very much in their culture, in their tribal chieftain culture, a sense of roughshod egalitarianism. It was a society with very democratic elements among the male warriors. So these are some of the things that he's saying. What I want to introduce to you now, and you see this suggested here. Remember, the definition of Roman and barbarian in the time here, before the real downfall, was always fluid. It was always possible for a barbarian to become Roman, and it was possible for a Roman, even, to lapse into quote-unquote barbarian behavior. So an interesting thing to consider is in saying these things, right, in making these moral generalizations about the barbarians, Tacitus was reminding his Roman audience, his Roman readership, that all of those things which Germans did not do, that the decadent Romans did do. All of the things which Germans did not do, the decadent Romans did do. So, for instance, the Germans did not particularly value silver or gold. They did not dress ostentatiously. They did not commit adultery. They did not pamper their children. So you see, by praising the Germans, he is indirectly criticizing the decadence and the corruption, the greediness of the Romans themselves. So you have to read this very carefully. Did he truly admire the Germans? Well, sometimes he does, but sometimes he's sort of ironical. He's a bit sarcastic in his praise. So what he's saying is that indeed there was a barbarian within the Romans, right? The barbarians could also be found within the Roman Empire, those who forgot the basic Roman values of frugality, modesty, dignity, and honor, and who were living in a lavish, ostentatious lifestyle. So I just want to guide you through a little bit about, on this. It's a reading typically that students enjoy very much. Okay, so let's look at the reading together. So if you read the first paragraph, the land may vary a certain amount in its appearance, but in general it either bristles with forest or festers with marshes. It is wetter on the side facing the Gauls, windier opposite Noricum and Pannonia, so Hungary and Austria. It is fertile for sown crops, but will not grow fruit trees. It is rich in livestock, but these are mostly undersized. Even on their foreheads, their cattle lack their proper distinction and glory. The people take pride in their quantity, for their cattle are their sole prized wealth. Silver and gold have been denied them by the gods, whether as a favor of anger, I cannot say. So when you read this, the reason why I'm reading it with you now, I want you to read it carefully, read between the lines. Is this praise? Is this censure? Is it criticism? Sometimes it's a mixture of both. So clearly, I think here he's praising them for the way that they weren't greedy and valued money. But you can see, what is he suggesting here about agriculture? Well, clearly, although they had cattle, they were undersized, and their lack of practicing settled agriculture was something that he held against him. So if you read this paragraph here, you will see that the kings were chosen by their noble birth. The kings did not have absolute power. The king was subject to a sort of quasi-democracy assembly. Now, this paragraph, you can gain some very important information about the women, the warriors, which should be absolutely clear to you. Women were also served as priestesses. Once again, read closely here to see the democratic elements. There was an assembly for each of the Germanic settlements. Additionally, go ahead and just go through all of this. I don't need to point out everything. Of course, always read carefully to see where you can see him sort of offering a double-sided criticism. Clearly, you can see here in this part, when they are not waging war, they occupy a little of their time in hunting, but a good deal is spent without occupation. They devote themselves to sleeping and eating. Clearly, they're perceived to be slovenly, not productive. Their military valor is praised, clearly. This is seen to be noble here. One thing that does seem to bother Tacitus is their lack of urbanization. They don't live in cities. They live in a scattered about manner, and it's not orderly, which the Romans liked. So they found their style of building houses sort of chaotic. Now this is a very important part here, given the importance of family to the Romans. The marriage code is very strict there, and there is no aspect of their morality that deserves higher praise. They are almost the only barbarians. They are almost the only barbarians who are content with a single wife, except for a very few who are not motivated by sexual appetite. It is rather that they are courted with numerous offers of marriage on account of their noble rank. So this is true. For the most part, the Germanic tribes were monogamous, but absolutely the chieftains practiced polygamy, took multiple wives. An important thing you see here is the Germanic dowry system. The dowry is not brought by the wife to the husband, but by the husband to the wife. Absolutely, a major difference with the Roman dowry. The Germanic dowry, the husband paid the wife's family for the bride. So you can see entertainment was not important to the Germanic tribes. Adultery was very rare. You can see the penalties that were inflicted for adultery. Quite very much humiliating women. Overall, you can also see here the concept of Wehrgeld. Wehrgeld was basically the idea of a blood price on the head of each and every person. So if a person in your family was murdered, you would have the right to inflict revenge on another clan and to sue them or get from them the sum of goods that person was worth. Again, each and every person had a sort of blood price on their head, a value of this individual human life. And what is interesting is actually women were valued more than men because of their childbirth abilities. So their blood price was typically 3 times that of men. You can see the way that the children are praised, the child rearing. So again, I'm just leading you through this because typically I read it with a class in the normal classroom. So what you should think about and what you will blog about is how Tacitus both praises and criticizes certain aspects of the Germanic culture, and is also talking about the notion of the barbarian within, how the Romans might have something to learn from the barbarians too. Okay, so going along with that, what we basically see if you take medieval Europe, if you take History 52, basically what you see is Rome is faced with onslaught of initially peaceful settlement by these barbarian tribes, but after Roman corruption and Roman greed, the Federate treaties break down and relations heat up, and Rome will be repeatedly sacked until the empire officially falls in 476 AD. So basically, even before Rome officially fell, the Roman Empire is essentially melding away, slowly transforming into a series of barbarian kingdoms, because these barbarian kingdoms are actually set up before the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed in 476 AD. So basically the Roman Empire is transformed into a series of barbarian kingdoms. So the Visigoths settle in Spain, the Franks settle in Gaul, a group called the Ostrogoths, the Eastern Goths settle in Italy, and the Vandals settle in North Africa. The eastern part of the Roman Empire, which is later called the Byzantine Empire, continues on in its autocratic method of government for a long time, over 1,000 years, till 1453. Now, I want to sort of give you a recap of some of the reasons we've talked about for Rome's decline. It's been a matter of debate among historians whether Rome declined, whether it fell more due to internal or more due to external factors. The traditional views tended to stress the external factors, tended to stress the barbarian invasions. But as I've presented it to you, I've sort of presented to you a revisionist version which has stressed, rather than the aggression of the barbarians, how the increasingly hostile relations between Roman and barbarians was due to the Romans themselves. The consensus today is to look more at the internal reasons for Rome's decline and how the Roman civic spirit, the Roman pride in the state and the empire was basically undermined or eroded from within. So I'll recap what we've talked about so far and give you some more factors, which I would invite you to read about more in the textbook. In class, right, I've stressed two things: Christianity and the barbarian invasions. So in terms of internal factors, Christianity with its otherworldly worldview is something that caused Romans to doubt the eternality of Rome and lose interest in the problems of the empire. So this is both the subculture of the call of the desert, of the life of Christian asceticism, the new form of Christian heroism, and as we saw with St. Augustine, the notion of the two cities, and basically the Christian worldview focused on salvation. The notion is that Christianity causes many Romans to become apathetic towards the fate of the empire. We also discussed the notion from Edward Gibbon of imperial overstretch. This is the notion that Rome collapsed due to its own weight. It was simply too large to be governed by any one individual or even four individuals, and simply with long, huge frontiers, it was simply too big to govern. So Rome's decline was a product of its own greatness. After the wars of conquest end, around 200 AD, the economy began to decline. The Romans faced an outbreak of bubonic plague between 250 and 400, which caused the population to drop by 20%. There was also a related effect that caused the markets to shrink because of the effects of the plague. So with the bubonic plague that hits between 250 and 400, there was a shrinkage of markets and especially long distance trade. So increasingly the economy was localized, and what you needed or traded would be grown in the area around you. As we said before, in the late empire, the Roman rulers ruled in an openly autocratic fashion. In the first 2 centuries, in the time of Augustus, the Roman emperors demanded little of the conquered people and citizens. Taxes were extremely low, really to the point of being negligible. Cities had self-government, but after 200, when the empire stops expanding and begins to run in trouble, the later Roman emperors begin to tax their people to the brink of really squeezing as much as they can out of them. And we mentioned this with Diocletian and, for instance, his edict on prices. So high taxes, we talked about the crisis of hyperinflation at the time of Diocletian. An interesting factor to consider is Romans' reliance on a slave economy. Commerce declined because of a failure to develop more industrial or technological methods of production. And I do not necessarily mean electricity, but I mean more progressive, advanced methods of manufacture. Now, this is a very similar situation you could think about with the American South. Basically, Rome's economy remains agrarian, remains based on agriculture, and less about manufacture. This was a direct result of the slave economy. When you have a huge slave population, right, a source of free labor, there's little incentive to develop time-saving labor innovations or more advanced sort of primitive factory production systems. I'm not talking the Industrial Revolution, but I mean more productive methods of producing of baskets or pottery. So there was no incentive to invest in technology or industry when you have an unlimited repository of manpower. However, the problem is that the wars of conquest end after 200 AD, and basically there was a severe manpower shortage after it became more difficult to get this free, unlimited supply of slaves, which they had previously had from their wars of conquest. So by the time they realized this manpower shortage, it became too late to be industrialized. Likewise, slavery left an indelible mark on attitudes and lifestyles of upper-class Romans. There was just this sort of cultural stigma against economic innovation and technology. It was considered beneath the dignity of Roman patricians to think of involving self in commerce or production. Upper classes, their wealth was based on landowning and slaves, agrarian economy. Some scholars cite the Romans' purely literary form of education. Their education stressed rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing persuasively, mythology, literature, and history. This sort of literary education prepared them for careers debating in government, but it was not a practical education. There was little stress on economics, right? Or as we might say today, the study of political science. Their education was not practical. It wasn't attuned to the nitty-gritty details of actually how to fix the problems of government. And certainly the aristocrats were not trained to apply themselves to economic problems. They were studying the Greek classics of philosophy. So when the economy and slave power declined, the system was too deeply entrenched to be able to adjust to these changed conditions. So I tend to stress, in my own understanding, the role of internal factors, particularly Christianity. Now, Constantine had converted to Christianity. He thinks he can use this new faith, Christianity, as a life preserver for the Roman Empire, and if this makes sense, hitch the fate of Christianity to the Roman Empire, and hitch the fate of the Roman Empire to Christianity, to use Christianity to prolong the life of the Roman Empire. But as we saw, it happened in a very different way. So rather than Rome conquering Christianity, using Christianity to extend the life of the empire, it's absolutely the opposite. Christianity hastens the fall of Roman civic pride with these notions of apathy towards politics. So finally, in terms of external factor, we see the role of the barbarian invasions, the increasing barbarianization of the army. So as we said, at its height, Rome was defined by an ability to absorb outsiders, to assimilate diverse peoples. So as we said, it was necessary for the Romans to turn to the barbarian tribes as a sort of auxiliary force in the army, as mercenaries to defend the Romans against other invading barbarian tribes. This becomes very important after 200 AD, after the wars of conquest ended. So what we see is the barbarianization of the army. At first, when the barbarians are included in the army, they have the opportunity to become Romanized. They didn't serve in separate units. But with the notion of the Federate treaties coming about in the 300s and 400s, the barbarians were used as separate auxiliary units. So as we said, in 200 AD, 5 to 10% of the army was made up of barbarians, but by 400, almost half of the army was made up of Germanic tribes. So at first, the Romans managed to keep the Germans in the army under control, and they would be Romanized, but by the end, things spiral out of control, and really the emperors are puppet figures controlled by their barbarian generals. I think what we talked about here, the inability to absorb outsiders. In the heyday of the Roman Republic, the Roman army was staffed by citizen soldiers, as we said, and the benefits of citizenship were extended to conquered peoples, right, provided that they served in the empire. So this inability to absorb outsiders, this rising tide of ethnic intolerance, for instance, we mentioned the anti-pants massacre, is something that was a major problem, right? And by this, of course, I mean the hardening definition of Roman and barbarian. And I would argue that this inability to absorb outsiders is really more an internal problem than an external problem. Okay, so after this, I would invite you to complete the last blog post on the Tacitus text. Thank you very much.